Assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let's start us off, Dr. Baldwin, by having you to take about 2 minutes of this first segment to talk about Dr. Lewis Baldwin. That will give our audience an idea in terms of who you are. I know who you are. Most of our audience know who you are. But take about 2 minutes to do that, and then the next 4 minutes of that segment to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and lay down the groundwork for our discussion for the morning.
Okay, I'm a native of Camden, Alabama. I grew up there in the late 40s and the 50s. I attended the segregated public schools in Wilcox County, Alabama from 1955 to 1967 when I graduated from high school, and Camden Academy High School in 1967. From there, I matriculated at Talladega College in Alabama, majored in history, minored in political science from 1967 to 71. From there to Crozer Theological Seminary, which had relocated at that time to Rochester, New York. I pursued an MA degree in Black Church Studies, a Master of Divinity degree in Theology, 1973, 1975. And from there to Northwestern University, where I received a PhD in American Christianity in 1980. And of course, from that point, I've been teaching and doing research and writing about Dr. King, focusing more specifically on the historical King, what I call the King in context, the King who set out to save the soul of America. If you recall the history of the Civil Rights Movement, you know that Dr. King said at the time of the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 that the goal of the SCLC was to save the soul of America, to redeem and transform the soul of America. And so for 13 years of his life, from 1955 up to 1968, that was his goal. And he felt that if he could somehow or another redeem and transform the soul of America, that would translate into social, political, and economic changes in society.
Dr. Baldwin, why don't you mention the assassination in reference to some of the books that you've written in reference to that, and talk about it from that perspective.
Yes, yes. I think the assassination, with the assassination of Dr. King, Lerone Bennett says that the civil rights movement turned the corner. In other words, there was a shift after the King assassination from civil rights activism to political involvement and participation. Black people focused their attention on registering to vote and getting involved in politics and the political processes of this country. So the assassination was indeed a turning point. It meant that we had to shift from that point to marching in the streets and sit-ins and demonstrations and boycotts, etc., to giving some kind of expression to the political and economic power that we were beginning to accrue.
And so in a real sense, the assassination represented the end of Dr. Martin Luther King's life, but it ushered in a new era.
A new phase in the civil rights movement.
Justice in reference to the civil rights movement.
Exactly.
Is that what we're saying?
A new phase, and that's where we are today, I think. When you look at movements like Black Lives Matter, etc., I see that as part of a natural progression of a movement that began not with Dr. King, but began during the period of slavery. And so we're talking about an unbroken chain of struggle that extends from the period of slavery up to the time of Dr. King, and now, of course, with movements like Black Lives Matter.
Okay, very good. And so what we'll do, we'll take our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and talk about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and we're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin. Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can take this 8-minute segment and give you an opportunity to start talking about specifically the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and what it meant to not only to the civil rights movement, but what it, well, you know, what it meant to the world from that perspective.
Yes, the assassination of Dr. King on April 4th, 1968 was a tragic episode in the history of this country and also in the world. Because at that time, by that time, of course, Dr. King had become a world leader. In fact, he referred to himself as a global citizen in his book, The Trumpet of Conscience. He referred to himself as a global citizen who was speaking out not only on Vietnam, but other world problems such as South African apartheid, the mistreatment of Jews in Russia. He was addressing all of these global problems at that time. So the assassination took from humanity a global citizen, a world leader, who had begun to see that the movement in America could not be separated from freedom movements around the world, from independence movements in Africa, from colonialism and neo-colonialism. He had begun to make all of these connections. And so I think the assassination hurt the world. It was detrimental not just for the United States, but for the entire world.
What are some of the events leading up to his assassination, Dr. Baldwin?
I would think that the shift in his attention from basic civil rights, constitutional rights, political enfranchisement, to issues of economic justice and international peace. Once he had started to attack the structures of capitalism, once he started to speak out against Vietnam, of course his days were numbered. Because as you well know, when you start, and Walter Rauschenbusch in his treatments of the social gospel has pointed out, that once you start attacking the economic structures of social evil, you're in trouble. Don't wear your best suit. And of course, Dr. King had begun to speak out against economic injustice, to call for a radical redistribution of economic power. He had begun to speak out on Vietnam, and many in the White House and in the Justice Department and intelligence agencies felt that that was not the prerogative of a private citizen. So once he had begun to speak out on these issues, I think his days were numbered, and of course his assassination was predictable.
How was that assassination? Tell me, I mean, how did that happen?
Well, it happened on April 4th, 1968, as I said. And interestingly enough, the night before, Dr. King had given his last speech, I See the Promised Land. And it was like he had a kind of premonition of what would happen in terms of his assassination. But it happened on April 4th, 1968. The argument, of course, is that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin, but we know from some of the more recent scholarship by scholars like William Pepper and others that the assassination resulted from a kind of conspiracy between elements in the federal government, the military, and of course segregationists. So his assassination, and Dr. King himself had said earlier in his career that he wouldn't live to see age 40. And of course we know that he was assassinated at age 39. Yes, so it occurred, I think, because he got involved in this issue of economic justice. He was planning this Poor People's Campaign for May, April, June 1968. He never lived to participate in that campaign, but he had planned to take a nonviolent army to Washington, D.C. to dramatize the problems of economic injustice and poverty in this country. And we know that when you start attacking the structures of economic injustice, when you start speaking out on issues of foreign policy, you're treading on dangerous ground.
You know, I think that we also celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign.
Exactly.
And why don't you say something about that in reference to Dr. Martin Luther King? Because I think that was in Memphis during the time, close to the time of his assassination.
Yes, well, he had actually started planning the Poor People's Campaign in 1967. And it was actually the first campaign planned by SCLC, his organization, from scratch. And of course, he went to Memphis because the sanitation strike there echoed the same kinds of issues that he was addressing in the Poor People's Campaign. And so the point at that point, he was concerned about elevating the civil rights movement to another level. That is, you move beyond basic civil and constitutional rights to address issues of economic injustice and economic inequality. And Dr. King said at that point, people have civil rights, they have the right of access, but if you don't have the money, if you don't have the economic power to enter these hotels and these restaurants, it makes no difference. So we have to begin to fight for economic justice issues, economic equality, so people can move beyond starvation wages to wages that can what? Meet their basic needs.
And so some of the same things that we're talking about today, because I think the Poor People's Campaign in Tennessee is also trying to do some of the things that the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King started 50 years ago, and we're still working with the same problems.
Yes, it's advancing some of the same concerns, but you know, we are too busy honoring Dr. King with monuments. There are more than 900 streets named after Dr. King in this country. There are monuments around the world. There's a church in Hungary named after him. There's a Martin Luther King Park in Israel. There's a statue in Westminster Abbey in Great Britain. So you have all of these monuments emerging across the world, but we have forgotten that he did not want that. What he wanted to be remembered for, of course, was his service to humanity. He tried to feed people, to find jobs for people. He fought for freedom, justice, and equality. And that's what we need to be focusing on.
Very good. And what we'll do, we'll take our third commercial break, and second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.